and welcome to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink. And this is the third episode in our series, X-Rated and Animated, The World of Ralph Bakshi, where we'll be digging into the work of a true and controversial auteur of animated cinema. Today, we'll be discussing Bakshi's first foray into the fantasy genre, 1977's Wizards.
There will come a time on the planet Earth when science and technology will be long forgotten, when humanity will rise from the ashes of nuclear holocaust, when wizards will rule the world. 20th Century Fox presents Wizards, a futuristic fantasy epic born in the mind of Ralph Bakshi, the master of animated magic. Wizards is a Tolkien world of fairies and elves, sorcerers, and demons. It is shot 10 million years from now against strange and huge panoramic settings. And it is more fantastic, more enchanting, and more powerful than anything you've seen before. Wizards, the ultimate futuristic fantasy epic.
All right, so we are going to, as Jeremy already mentioned, discuss Wizards today. We do want to touch on a film that came before this by Bakshi that we're not going to go into fully for a couple reasons. One reason is because we feel like we've covered a lot of the same territory with our Fritz the Cat episode. It's very similar in tone and its humor and satire. And also heavy traffic a bit as well. So this is it's a little bit more of the same kind of a thing. It's still worth watching, I would say, and still good as far as Bakshi's work goes. But as far as what we're going to be focusing on, I think we want to kind of go on to his next big project. But before we do, we want to just touch on this one. So this was Coonskin, 1975. It received mixed reviews, right, Jeremy? It was not really well received, we would say.
Yeah, it was. So Coonskin, it was a 1975 live-action and animated crime film written and directed by Bakshi that followed an African-American rabbit, fox, and bear who rise to the top of an organized crime racket in Harlem, and it deals with the mafia, corrupt law enforcement, and other city themes. And at this point, is mostly remembered for it being controversial, for its controversy. In that the depiction of the African-American characters, as well as just other racial, religious, and other stereotypes along those lines, kind of overshadowed the actual work of art in and of itself. It's a pretty interesting film, but like Mark mentioned, kind of we've already covered some of the territory, and it strays a little bit. But if you are interested in exploring all of Bakshi's work, it's definitely worth checking out. But
yeah, definitely.
We digress, and back to what we're talking about today, which is Wizards from 1977. Wizards is an animated post-apocalyptic science fiction fantasy film written and produced by Bakshi and animated along with his team that follows a battle between two wizards who are brothers of opposing powers, one representing magic and nature and love, and the other representing industrial technology, hate, evil, and war.
Mm-hmm. Some interesting themes for what's supposed to be a children's film, a family film, I guess, is what Bakshi set out to make for this one. So this is, at the end of the day, when I think about all his work, I think this would be my favorite of his films. And it's different than anything else he really did. He would return to the fantasy genre, obviously, a couple of times, most notably with the Lord of the Rings adaptation that he did after this, immediately after this, actually. And he also did a film called Fire and Ice, which dealt with fantasy elements. But this was his first foray into that realm, and quite different from what we had seen before, right?
Yeah, quite different, yeah.
But it works in some weird way. It's his own world that he created. He started from scratch, and he just took influences that he loved, like things from comic books or old, pulp novels and things like that. And he worked that together with a message. And that message, I think, is a really important one, and one that runs pretty deep. And I think he goes some interesting places with that message. Yeah. And as you mentioned, Jeremy, it's the main conflict here is between technology and magic.
Yeah.
So magic, and he uses that in obviously not in like the actual this is magic. It's more of a metaphor
Mm-hmm.
for creativity and originality and free speech and all of that kind of thing, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But really, this film is a warning against an over reliance on technology, which is something that Bakshi has talked about as well. Because even at the time that he made this movie, he started to see things going in a certain direction. And, he said himself, technology is great and it helps people and it can be a really positive thing. But if you don't keep certain aspects of it in check and you don't keep certain people in check regarding technology, there can be some consequences. And I think this film really delves into that.
Yeah, and as we mentioned earlier, so to give it a little bit of context, coming off of Coonskin, as we mentioned, there was a lot of controversy surrounding Bakshi. His work had been protested, and I think that he maybe saw this film as an opportunity to kind of regain his footing as a creative person.
Yes.
I think he wanted to get away from the controversy a little bit and
Yeah.
create something that really was more about telling a good story and
Hmm.
expressing ideas that wasn't just being picked apart for its politics.
Right.
So this was originally intended to be a children's film. I wouldn't necessarily recommend watching this with your young children.
Hmm.
Or
Maybe older children, like
yeah, like
late teens or
yeah, like I'd say like a teenage, like young to late teenagers can handle
yeah.
this. There are definitely some pretty dark themes. The one evil brother in this draws a lot of parallels to Hitler, and not in a subtle way either. He's pretty
No, quite
directly
literally.
expressed
Hmm.
as a Hitler-esque character,
He
and
basically idolizes Hitler,
yeah, he idolizes
pretty
Hitler
much.
and
Yeah.
uses Hitler's methods of um, rounding up troops and creating, using hate speech and all of that to kind of guide his army
Yeah.
to doing dastardly things. So
Hmm.
definitely not a lighthearted little children's movie.
It
Um,
has moments of lightheartedness, I would say. I mean, particularly for a Ralph Bakshi movie.
yeah,
But as you're saying, I mean, the overall themes and whatnot are pretty dark. So to call this a kids movie, maybe not. Maybe in the 70s, because back then, Jaws was PG, and
yeah.
the rating system really wasn't really what it is
There
today.
was there were less lines
Yeah, and
drawn.
we had talked about that before a little bit, but that was very evident at this time, and I think Bakshi. But I think again for him, I think this was lighter fare in a lot of ways, and really he was pushing himself. I mean, he said this in a lot of interviews that he had made the kind of street level urban type film, which we did discuss already, and those were well received, but he wanted to try to do something different. He wanted to take his different influences and try to make his own fantasy film, and that's what Wizards is at the end of the day. And it is actually Fox's first feature length animated film as well, which I found interesting. So they really took a risk on him, even though he had been pretty successful before this. I mean, as you said, Jeremy, Coonskin had come out right before this, and that movie was heavily protested and demonstrated against, and there were smoke bombs going off in theaters, and
Hmm.
there's a story about Martin Scorsese walking past, or actually he was filming, I believe, for Taxi Driver, I think, and this was going on around him, so it was a pretty big deal. So for Fox to take a risk like this, I could not imagine that this day and age,
No.
but for some reason, I guess he knew someone that helped him out there. But yeah, he was able to make this fantasy film pretty big. And actually, part of that, I think, is because this film was very low budget. I would actually have to compare it to the other ones. I think it might be on the lower end, but
Yeah.
he produced this very cheaply, which was part of the reason that he used a lot of the experimental techniques that he normally uses, but he does it to an even more of an effect in this one. I think and a lot of that was for budget because he wanted to use he uses a lot of stock footage and previously filmed footage and things like that in the film, and a lot of that is for budgetary reasons. But I think it works really well with his kind of hodgepodge, throw everything into the into the pot and see what happens. I think it works really well in this film. But how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a collage, in the way it's
Mm-hmm.
created. Like visually, and to me it helps give it that otherworldly feel. in
Yeah.
a way, because it's not such a conventional, like, it's not a conventional cartoon style. First of all, his style, as we've already seen and talked about in our previous episode, he had a very unique style. That's why we would venture to call him an auteur. I think is his style,
Mhm.
both visually but also thematically, is very
Yeah.
distinct. But I think in this particularly, because he was using so much of this, so much rotoscoping, he was using a lot of stock footage. He
Yeah.
really did a nice job of creating something that felt otherworldly.
Mhm.
This did feel like a distant future. It didn't just feel
Yeah.
like, because I think a lot of the time for me, I mean, we had our whole science fiction series,
Mhm.
but I think sometimes when things get a little too futuristic,
Mhm.
it can be kind of, it almost doesn't feel like it could have ever come from the time we're in now. And to
Mhm.
me, this film, what it did well is it really showed the kind of misinterpretation of relics. There was one scene,
Religious
yeah.
relics. Say, yeah. Oh, sorry. You can talk about
Well, there was
that.
one scene where they're in what's, I guess this is kind of a church or some house of
Mhm.
worship, and the relics that are there aren't Jesus imagery. It's not,
Mhm.
any really known religion. It's like Coca-Cola posters
Yeah.
and other pop
Yeah.
culture elements that this civilization way down the line
Mhm.
has decided that, were our most religious things, which to me is such an interesting idea. Because if someone, I think, were to, if an alien were to come to the
Mhm.
United States, or most countries, I guess, at this point, and they see that the kind of things that we're worshiping, they would probably be led to believe that we worshipped, Apple and Kim Kardashian, and it's
Yeah.
like
Star Wars.
yeah, Star Wars. Like I don't think that the conclusion would be that religion really played much
Yeah.
of a role at all.
They would almost be seen as like very eclectic cults or something like that. I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, it'd be a
Which
confusing.
yeah, it's and I do like how far in the future this is set. And I also
Mhm.
love that the movie opens with the world exploding, which is
Yeah,
just great. Well, not exploding, I guess, but lots of bombs going
yeah,
off.
being
It
devastated by
ends. It
nuclear war.
it begins with Armageddon, basically. Yeah,
Mhm.
which is just kind of like an interesting way to open up a film. Um, so we should start by just kind of going. We don't go too much into plots in this podcast, as you probably know by now, but we do hit on lots of, we try to get some of the main story beats down, or just what the basic premise is. So for this film, as I said, it's technology versus magic. So there's these two wizards. It's Avatar, who is the good wizard basically, and then there is Black Wolf, who is the evil wizard, and they are brothers. And there's a prologue, I guess, that starts out the film, where these kind of like tableau style with the narrator, which is kind of nice. It really feels like a storybook, kind of like a fairy tale or something. So that's what brings you in to the movie, and they tell you about these two brothers who are at odds and they fight each other, and basically the good wizard Avatar goes into exile almost, and the evil wizard he is basically in hiding and kind of getting his army together to he has all this technology that he's found, from the relics of the past, which is our current time, or the 70s, I guess,
Yeah,
when the film was made. And so he discovers all of this. I don't know what you call it. I guess technology and paraphernalia and all these things. And one of the things he discovers is actual newsreel footage of the Nazis invading different areas, and war footage from the Second World War.
and a
So
projector.
and a projector, so he
Yeah.
can show this to his loyal subjects, and they get worked up about it. They get all riled up, and it's basically showing that this evil nature is still exists, and that certain people are still drawn to doing to atrocities, basically to causing these kind of war atrocities. So that's the basic premise, that they eventually try to take over the land that they live in, which is basically like an imaginary land, but it is supposed to be Earth.
Mhm.
And I want to talk about Avatar as a main character or a main protagonist, because he's not a typical wizard. I would say he's not whimsical or anything like that.
No,
He's not really even wise.
no.
He's just like a cigar chomping, like crotchety, uh, sort of like a bored take on this type of character. Like he's kind of he just like seems exhausted and over everything, and kind of like I don't know. I find him very comical and enjoyable, like as a main character, and like sort of interesting. He's like very, like I said, like tired and kind of just like goes, for the first part at least, he's kind of just going along with the adventure. He's not really, he has this thing with his brother, but he's not really gonna, he's not concerned with doing too much about it because he's kind of just like given up on everything at that point.
Yeah.
But he's still optimistic, sort of, and that kind of takes over towards the end, which is kind of like a cool journey that he goes on with the other characters. And he's also modeled after Peter Falk, which is funny, like the way he talks and moves around and stuff. Like just 1 minute, that kind of
yeah.
thing. So it's kind of like a fun main character. What did you think about him?
Well, yeah, I think he's a kind of interesting main character. Because he's not really an anti-hero. He's not like a bad dude. He's just kind of lazy. Like he just doesn't really seem into. Which is so kind of contrary, because in the traditional hero's journey, there'll be that moment where the hero kind of rejects the quest, but then eventually when they accept it, it's just they're full-fledged in it. But for him, it's kind of like he's kind of trying to reject the quest the whole time.
It kind of goes back to our Slacker series where we talked about with
like he's just kind of
protagonists.
Which might be an interesting statement, because you think about his brother, Black Wolf, has been living in this dark land in this horrible environment for years and years and years. So he wants to make.
Determined.
He's very determined because he's pissed and he's jealous and what. But whereas Avatar, as a character, I think he's kind of been living comfortably. Like he doesn't really seem all that concerned with things.
Every time you see him, he has his feet up, his shoes are off. He's like smoking a cigar with his feet. And
I think he's just laid back, and he's just kind of reluctant to a journey, just because it's been so long since he's actually had to really do anything. Yeah. It's just kind of like, oh, he's just chilling, and personally, after years and years of peace and relaxation, who wouldn't be a little adverse to having to go back to doing some kind of intense, violent, scary thing. Going back to Fritz the Cat, weirdly though, I wonder if, because we know that Bakshi has discussed hippie culture a lot, and you look at Avatar, and even though Avatar is painted in like obviously a much better light than Black Wolf, he kind of is almost reminiscent of like the hippies in a weird way, where it's like
there's a little bit of Fritz the Cat in him.
There's a little bit of Fritz the Cat in him, where he's kind of just more interested in kind of feeling things out. And ultimately it almost, that almost ends up being his downfall. Yeah. So I think that, Bakshi, as we've talked about before, doesn't really spare anyone in his work. Any character who is there will be critiqued. They'll be if it's a character that ultimately has good intentions and looks to do good things in the world, I think ultimately that character will be praised, that character will be supported, but it won't be without that critique. And I think that Avatar is an interesting character because, as you mentioned, Mark, he's so not the traditional wizard who would just be this all-knowing, all-good. Yeah. He's a pretty, like he almost messes things up as much as his enemies do.
Yeah, he's no Gandalf, that's for sure. He's like, he's not, I just like that he's just not your stereotypical wizard. Like, he did something different with that type of character. Yeah. So, though the story of wizards is more epic in a lot of ways, I still find it very personal. Yeah. A personal film, like all his films are in some way. So, obviously, there's the Nazi Holocaust allusions and imagery that we talked about. There's the actual newsreel footage that he uses. Definitely not something you would see in a typical fantasy film, but I think it was important for the story that he wanted to tell, and I think that Bakshi, coming from a Jewish family, I think it was very personal for him in a lot of ways, and I feel like he was getting a lot of demons out with this film in a fantasy setting, in like a very fantastical way. I think it just he was able to do that. And do you think that Bakshi, this is a question I thought when I was watching the film last time, do you think he views animation or creativity in general as magic? Like, we talk about magic in the film. Do you think that that's something that he was trying to say with this film?
Well, yeah, I think that, and that was something I was thinking about too. I think animation, but I think more just imagery and specifically motion pictures in general, he views as not only magic, but extremely powerful. Because in this film, the thing that ultimately is the greatest weapon for Black Wolf and his army isn't the weapons that they have. Like they found guns from the past, they found
Yeah.
tanks, but that's ultimately not the biggest weapon they have. The biggest
Mhm.
weapon they have is footage of Adolf
Yeah.
Hitler from World War II.
It's an
And
idea
yeah, it's an
almost.
idea. And I think
Hmm.
that's what I think in Bakshi's work that he almost views as magic is he
Hmm.
sees creativity and he sees images and motion pictures as serious power. You know,
Hmm.
and I think that coming off of a movie like Coonskin, where it became clear to him that what he was doing with his creative work had that real world influence and could really upset people and really make people intensely passionate or pissed
Hmm.
off, but also, if used correctly, could make them loving. You know, I think maybe, and this is all just speculation, I haven't ever talked about Bakshi nor heard him say this in an interview, but maybe, you know, the response, the confused and I don't want to say misinterpreted, because I don't think Bakshi has necessarily gone on the record about Coonskin saying what his intention was, but the fact
Hmm.
that people interpret it in such a way that they thought he was saying something that was racially insensitive or malicious, and
Hmm.
he probably didn't intend for that, made him have this realization about the power of images and the power
Yeah,
of
that's
the
true.
ability for images and art to influence and be misinterpreted.
Right.
Because that is a big thing in this movie. That's the
Definitely.
weapon that they
Yeah.
have is
Hmm.
ideas and propaganda.
Right. He's gone on record himself to say not all technology is bad, and that
Hmm.
he understands that it has to be there. But when you lose, like the idea of losing magic or losing creativity or things like that, I mean that's scary, and that's something that you have to keep it in check, and you have to always be vigilant about things like that. And I think that's more what this film is trying to say. It's not trying to say all technology is bad. It's just
Hmm.
saying, keep an eye on it, and make sure it doesn't get out of hand, basically. So at the end of the day, you're still a human being, and you have to have your mind and your creativity and things that, that you keep you sane. I think he was trying to really show that in this film.
Yeah, I mean, as we even mentioned before, he used a lot of new technologies to make this film. You know, in
Yes, he
terms of
did.
his animation, but I think it was he saw them as a means to getting somewhere positive. I mean, and spoiler alert, as we always have on
Hmm.
the show, the way that Avatar
Yeah, I
ends
want to
up
talk about that.
resolving the conflict
Hmm.
is he shoots his brother with a gun. And
Right.
throughout the whole movie, Avatar has been kind of protesting any
Hmm.
violent technologies that are out there, but this entire time he's been holding this gun that he says is something that his mother taught him, which
Yeah.
means that even during the 3,000 years of peace, the
Hmm.
queen, who was supposed to be this like peaceful, almighty, wonderful person, was still had that secret, or not the secret, but the understanding that sometimes the force and technology is necessary,
Hmm.
but it has to be used responsibly and only at a
Right.
time. And this could be a parable, if you think about it, to how the United States behaved in World War II a little bit.
Hmm.
I think the character of Avatar, because historically, you know, the United States tried to stay out of the war, as Avatar did. He said, "Oh no, we don't need
Yeah.
to do this. We don't need to do this." And
Right.
then eventually, he kind of got begrudgingly involved. But then, by the
Hmm.
end of the war, he's the one doing the most violent acts, as the
Hmm.
United States was with the nuclear bomb, because they
Yeah.
viewed it as a necessary evil,
And it
which
culminates with him pulling the trigger.
with him
Yeah.
pulling the trigger. Which, of course, you know, that's something that's hotly debated to this day, whether the United States
Yeah.
dropping the nuclear bombs
Hmm.
was necessary or whether it was an excessive use of force
Right.
that killed a lot of innocent people. And I think it could be said in this movie, you know,
Man.
like by the time that Avatar actually pulls the trigger, like it looked like there might have been other ways for him to solve it, but
Yeah.
he saw it as a necessary evil and did what he had
Yeah.
to do.
Man. A lot of this film is more prescient than ever. I feel like right now it's
Yeah.
just like the messages it has. Wow. It's just I don't know. It's hard to believe almost that it was the '70s because it's just you
Hmm.
look at it and it's just the messages are they're universal in a way. It's just
Yeah.
it's pretty amazing. But let's talk about how he does deliver these messages because we hit on the experimental nature a little bit. I want to go into that a little bit more.
Hmm.
So um, just as we've seen in his previous films, Bakshi employs a lot of experimental techniques in this film. And as I mentioned, it was also a way to work around his budget, constrictions that he had. So he uses live action backgrounds. He uses stock footage. He uses different animation techniques. He actually uses some rotoscoping, which we talked about a little bit in our last episode, where you basically a live footage or a live figure would be traced over and used in an animated way. And he does that in this film with the stock footage. Actually, a lot of the old war footage, he would draw over them, and he would add things to certain aspects, like he would give things wings, or certain soldiers or the horses or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But he has tanks in there. He has all kinds of stuff, and so that the reason for that is manyfold, because there was the budget reasons. There was the experimental nature that he brings to his films. He likes to use different techniques because to him it's like, this is animation. We should be creative with it, and he likes to throw different things in like that because it's all about the message, really. If these techniques get across the message, and then that's all that matters. But also, he wanted to really emphasize that the evil side. He wanted to make them scary. And I'm sure kids would be scared by the imagery in this. And I mean, it's a little terrifying even to me watching it even now.
Totally.
As a man in his 30s, it's like, because there is something to the technique of rotoscoping where it looks real, but it's not. And the fact that he uses this old footage, I mean, there's something very creepy and sinister about it. And all the blacks and, like the different colors he uses, the grays and these really dark colors that he invokes, it really adds to it. Did you get that kind of feeling from these scenes?
Yeah, I thought it was pretty daunting and disturbing, and I think that use of the real footage and real imagery made it feel even more so, because I think generally with cartoons, at least personally when I see a cartoon, my expectation and kind of goal is to see something that's totally removed from what I would consider like real feeling. I want something kind of magical and out there, and this was, and I think he, like as we said before, he did such a good job creating that otherworldliness, but I think he also, because he used, I mean, the first shot of the movie is live action.
It is, yeah.
And I think by incorporating things that felt, but by making it feel like it could almost be just this underbelly of the real world, it felt kind of more intense and scary and
like an alternate reality kind of.
Yeah, like it's not so much that, and it's not supposed to be a different, like it's not like Middle Earth, it's not that. It's supposed to be here. It's supposed to be, I think, in the United States, just years and years and years, from now. And I think that by using some of that real imagery, it was kind of a reminder of that like, even though this seems absurd, and to a certain extent it is, this is coming off of a time when, I mean, obviously the threat of nuclear war is still present today, but this was coming off of a time when a lot of people, Bakshi had already been born when the bombs were dropped. It's like this, for this generation, this kind of post-war, growing up since World War II generation, that threat of nuclear war and those kind of things was still very present.
It was on the mind, yeah.
Yeah, also, Bakshi growing up, he was born in 1938. And so you have to think, if you think about it, when he's, 15, 16 years old, which is kind of the most important time for young movie watchers generally, the movies that were coming out were a lot of those 1950s sci-fi movies that were all about how scary things could be if a nuclear bomb went off. They were about the unknown effects of radiation, So this movie, even though it seems like it's a stretch that radiation would do that to people, like, to a certain extent, like I think that the fairies and everything, like, that's a stretch, but the idea of these kind of, like, disturbed, deformed, grotesque human beings, that's not so far off. If like what radiation can do to a person, like, it can really, it's horrifying. So I think that in rooting it in that reality, he created something that was kind of a lot. It dug into something a little deeper than your average cartoon is able to.
For sure. And that rotoscoping technique with Black Wolf's evil army, that in contrast to the traditionally animated other side, the good, quote unquote, good side of the wizards and the fairies, is something that's pretty interesting. You don't see that a lot at all in animation.
Yeah.
To have such a stark contrast there is interesting.
Yeah. It's like they're sketches. Like, they're not even
Yeah, it's almost like
like human.
it's almost like they're fighting this real thing, and like it's so real, you know,
Yeah.
and they're up against it. It's interesting.
Yeah.
And so there's we talk about Bakshi's style a little bit. I want to touch on it here because this film is a combination of Bakshi's sort of rough animation style, I guess you call it, along with his usual satirical tone. I think it's still there, right?
Yeah.
It's still in place in a lot of parts, like you said, with the Coca-Cola relics and stuff like that. And he still has that conversational dialogue as well, which really works in an interesting way, I think, against the backdrop of a grand fantasy story. It's interesting, it's particularly the way Avatar speaks is just kind of, I mean, it really is Peter Falk. Essentially, it's just, it's Columbo, like, in this world of fantasy. The other characters, I would say they probably don't speak as naturalistically as him, but I think him in particular, like, really he carries that kind of that ground level street urban style that Bakshi delves into a lot. And so it's a sort of a fairy tale mixed with sci-fi elements, real world elements. It's really hard to classify in a lot of ways, which, as with most of Bakshi's work, I would say.
Well, and one thing that we don't need to talk about it too long, but just a brief thing that I found particularly interesting was his use of music in this film. Because
let's talk about that.
As far
Great
as
soundtrack, I think,
as far as I know, this is the only fantasy I've ever filmed that has used jazz music, at least in a way that's not like tongue in cheek. Like they very earnestly would incorporate jazz and funk, there was contemporary music in this film, contemporary to the time,
along with more of the like fantasy, like instrumental type music as well.
Yeah, there was kind of a mix, and I thought that was something that was particularly interesting for me. I'm a huge Paul Thomas Anderson fan, as I talk about all the time on this podcast, and it kind of brings to mind for me a movie like There Will Be Blood, where you have some of the music of the time, but you also have who's it, like John? Like very contemporary scoring.
Yeah.
That sounds like it could be an experimental piece of music that would be played out like not having any connection to a period piece.
It gives you like a different perspective.
Yeah, and to me that gives films, it ties them to their time, but it also kind of opens them up from their time a little bit.
Right.
Because it says, oh, we're going to do something contemporary. We're doing something that it's present, especially for a film like this, where even though it's set in the future, when you're watching characters fighting with swords, immediately we think, oh, this is the past. This doesn't have anything to do with us. But I think setting some of those scenes to contemporary music gives it the feeling like, oh, this is something that we have to pay attention to. This is something that is present now.
And that's sort of ballsy in its own way, too. I mean, I'll call him a ballsy guy. I mean,
absolutely,
he takes a lot of risks, Bakshi does. So, I mean, I think, that's not a very typical fantasy trope. You would not see that at all. Like you would just see like your typical generic soundtrack, which and I think all the music is good. I think all the score that was made for this film is very good. There's actually like an original song, Time Will Tell, I believe it's called, that plays through the credits, and just like some beautiful stuff. And also I found some of the painted backgrounds were just very beautiful. Some of the techniques that were used. He actually he employed two different background artists for this, because obviously he worked on it, but he wasn't the only one. There was a whole team of animators that he had, and he personally hired these background illustrators because he liked their work and he thought they would bring something really unique to the film, and I think they did. And I think it's a type of movie where you could watch it with the sound off and still really appreciate it. Like it has that look.
Yeah.
And so you have Bakshi's usual style of animation, which I said is kind of rough or raw or however you want to describe it like that. But then you have these backgrounds, which are particularly the scenes with Black Wolf and his evil dominions and whatnot. Just really stark, complicated, kind of, like I said, beautiful, I think, backgrounds, which really contrast what everything else that you see. And then you have the more fantasy like backgrounds in the forest and things like that. So really cool stuff going on, even with the sound off. If you just looked at the screen, I think you'd always see something worthwhile there.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on a little bit, as we're kind of running out of time here, we would be remiss with this movie if we didn't talk about a little bit of some of
in the room,
the behind the scenes kind of things that went on. So where to start? So
well, I mean, the big elephant here is that this film, Wizards, opened against a little movie called Star Wars.
Yes.
It actually opened, I believe, 2 weeks before. And there is a Mark Hamill connection because Mark Hamill actually shows up in this movie for like a minute
Yes.
as like a fairy character or something like that. So he's actually in it. He was actually recommended by George Lucas. So George Lucas and Ralph Bakshi knew each other. They were friends. And they were talking about their movies and what they were working on. And, Bakshi told him, "Oh, I'm working on this movie, Wizard Wars." But George Lucas already had the idea for Star Wars. So he's like, he asked him, "Would you mind changing it?" He did. Rest is history.
Well, you know why he changed it? I learned this recently.
Well, I read about it a little bit, but what did you...
So apparently Bakshi was open to changing the name for two reasons. One, because he liked the name Wizards, but also because George Lucas had allowed Mark Hamill to take time off from Star Wars in order to record his voice part for Wizards. So
Okay,
it was
he
a
did
kind
him
of
a favor.
a little bit of a favor.
Yeah.
But interestingly, with these two, because they knew each other and they were both involved with the same studio in the making of their films, they kind of worked together a little bit in terms of not on each other's films, but in kind of supporting each other. And as the story goes, I can't confirm this because I wasn't in the room, but in the research I've done, as the story goes, what happened is both of them needed more money for their respective films. And so they either together or supporting each other separately went into the studio heads and asked for more money and were turned down, but were told that if they would put their own money into their films, and both of them obviously having some money because George Lucas was coming off of American Graffiti, which was a huge hit, and Bakshi had already had a couple big hits, they were told that if they put their own money into the films, that they could own the merchandising rights to the films. So they both agreed to that and put their own money in, which for Bakshi ended up being a good decision, and for George Lucas ended up being a $4 billion good decision. So that
the best decision ever.
The best decision ever.
Made.
And so that actually really kind of changed, if you think about it, that interaction kind of changed the history of movie business and movie industry forever, because it was one of the first times that a creator had ownership over, it was really probably the first movie property of that size, so there was no precedent, but for the creator, for the director to have ownership of a property like that was just totally unheard of. And this was a time when, the studio system was being broken. The old Hollywood had pretty much already was dead, but this was a totally new thing, this idea of creator as merchandiser, creator. It was a totally new
and I'm sure when Lucas told them that, they were like, "Oh, sure, whatever." Like in the back of their heads, they're like, "Well, that's not gonna."
Yeah, this is gonna be a one-off science fiction film that.
Like we'll get all the money and he'll get nothing. But in the end, it ended up being the best deal he could have made. That was it was a gamble at the time, but like you said, it set a precedent, and now that's like standard in every Hollywood contract, I'm sure, of films of this kind of like magnitude.
At least that's the goal of the filmmaker.
The property, because
if they can,
right. The IP is the most lucrative. It's like the golden nugget that you really want. So that and Lucas started all that. And him and Bakshi were buddies back then, and the fact that Star Wars came out 2 weeks after Wizards, obviously wasn't great for Bakshi because, because Wizards actually did pretty well. And like I said, it was very low budget, and he had prided himself on keeping it under the budget and everything like that. So when it came out, it actually did pretty well. But obviously once Star Wars came out, that was it.
That was it.
That just.
I'm a little surprised that, and maybe it was just that they thought they were different enough, but I'm a little bit surprised because they were communicating. You would think that Bakshi probably saw a cut of Star Wars at some point, and
probably,
and maybe in watching it, he didn't think it was going to be as big of a thing as it was. I personally have a hard time, if I was around in the 70s and someone showed me Star Wars, have it to say that I would never put my movie anywhere near that. If I was Bakshi, I probably would have been just put yours out. Mine will come out a year from now.
Well, there is a story that when Lucas was first showing people, because he did show people the film that he knew. I'm sure he probably did show Bakshi at some point. But when he would show people the film, before it was finished, the main thing is before the audio was completed, before they had the sound finished of the film, people were not impressed at all. They were like, okay.
Interesting.
But then the second once Walter Murch came in and edited the sound together and all that, it blew people away. Honestly, that was like the big story behind that is that the sound is really what made people stand up and like realize that it was something. Not to say that people didn't realize before that. I'm sure there were people, but in the early stages, people probably didn't. They really didn't know what was coming. How could you know something like
that's
that?
true. Yeah, you never know. People, you don't know something's a hit until it becomes a hit.
And Wizards, is pretty different. It's an animated film, and it's
Yeah.
more of a fantasy than like a sci-fi, I would say. But I guess I don't know. I think Star Wars was just such a phenomenon that it just took over everything. I think it doesn't matter what the film was that came out before. It just doesn't,
Well, and it hasn't let go since.
And it hasn't. No,
It's not.
it's 2019, and now
Yeah.
we have a new Star Wars movie coming out this year. So yeah, it's crazy. So and obviously Bakshi, I would say more than sci-fi, he very heavily influenced by fantasy genre.
Yeah.
The comic books that he read, and he was a huge Lord of the Rings fan, which is something that we're going to touch on in a bit too. But he has a lot of obvious allusions to Lord of the Rings with this film. But whereas Lord of the Rings is more of a straight take on fantasy material and kind of became the template in a lot of ways for that kind of thing, Wizards is more of a Bakshi film at the end of the day. It's more of a personal film, but still has an epic tale, epic story to it. I think you can enjoy it on that level for sure. And Bakshi would go on to adapt, not the entire Lord of the Rings, but he would release a film that I believe it's the first book and part of the second book.
Yeah.
I believe it's like halfway through the Two Towers.
It ended in a very weird point, and he was very upset about that.
I mean, that was obviously not his intention. He intended to complete it because he was a huge fan of Tolkien and loved Lord of the Rings and wanted to finish it. And everyone thought he did a good job with it. So I don't know. We would have to look into that more maybe for our next episode to find out why that didn't end up happening. But yeah, he does release an adaptation of Lord of the Rings immediately after this film. I was actually surprised. I think it's the next year, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of crazy. So he releases that. So he was still on this fantasy kick here, and he does, he dips into this genre again a little bit later in the 80s. So, and he uses rotoscoping to a very large degree in Lord of the Rings, to a point where now when he talks about it, he's actually a little, not regretful, but he looks at rotoscoping as sort of like a lesser animation style in a way now, where he kind of wishes he didn't use it as much. But, at the time, I think it was just like a realistic way to get these huge battle scenes completed. And again, it's when it comes down to budget, it's a little bit more feasible to use rotoscoping. So he did what he had to do. But I think Wizards stands as its own kind of epic fantasy tale with a little sci-fi mixed in. And I think it's very undeniably Bakshi, which, somehow he's able to maintain his signature through the entire thing, which is really something to I think praise, because an auteur making a film like this, even if it is your idea, you can kind of get lost in the mix. But I think he still shines through in this film, as well as his team of animators and his background artists that really did an amazing job with this movie. It's kind of a mishmash, but I think, me personally, I think it really works. I think all the elements come together, and like Bakshi said, in the end, it's about the feeling, it's about the message, and I think that comes across. But what did you think about this movie? Was there anything that stuck out about it to you that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I think it was just, for me, it was just a surprising combination. With this movie, I think I saw it when I was younger. It's one of those things where, as I think I've mentioned on other episodes of this series, Bakshi has one of those styles where I don't know if it's because it's been imitated or what, but like, at least personally, I feel like I've seen a lot more of his stuff than I maybe actually have. It just has this real sense of familiarity to it.
Yeah.
And so I think I've seen this when I was younger, but in watching it now, what really stuck out to me was just that combination of these kind of like industrial authoritarian images with fantasy and the music and the kind of that weird juxtaposition was just really interesting for me. As I was watching this, where my mind was kind of going, which might be sacrilege, was like, what would a live action adaptation of this be like?
Oh
no. No, I know, it's just a terrible idea, but I'm like,
but it's not so far fetched, because there is so much.
But not even that, but not
action.
necessarily an adaptation, but something along the lines of like has anyone done this kind of like futurist industrial combined with fantasy thing? And it was just like it just felt really fresh to me.
Like, yeah. I mean, that type of setting is explored a lot. I would say mostly like in the 80s, you saw a lot of fantasy sci-fi films with that kind of aesthetic. Now I feel like a lot of sci-fi, they go for that Blade Runner kind
Yeah.
of look where it's like neo noir kind
But
of.
not the fantasy nature.
No, not really. Yeah, you don't see much of that.
Yeah.
You're totally right about
Yeah,
that.
no,
Actually.
it just felt really interesting and fresh to me, and also
Yeah.
it didn't feel like it prioritized the technology over the fantasy.
Yeah.
It felt like really it was a fantasy story that involved technology and not the other way around.
Yeah.
Which felt fresh to me. I couldn't really think of any other. If you have any examples, feel free to reach out and we can discuss it next time.
Let us know.
But
it really stays true to the fantasy genre. I think. It's I think it's pretty impressive, honestly, and it's very unique.
Mm-hmm.
Very unique. You don't see much like it. He actually wanted to make a sequel to this, but as of 2019 has yet to happen.
And yeah.
So I don't know if we're gonna see that. But what I really love about this movie, and honestly, there's a lot of moments in it that I like. But that imagery of the, I would say the Nazi imagery is just the most striking and kind of what comes to mind when you think of this movie. It's like that and wizards, and it's melding in your brain is kind of like crazy.
Yeah.
And I think that really, like, that starkness of it is really interesting. And I love that it's a family film that doesn't talk down to kids.
Yeah.
A lot of people claim that about their films, but I really think this does not at all. I think it's very grown up, even though it's about wizards and fairies and all that.
Yeah, it feels adult.
I think it feels very adult, and but it's still, at the end of the day, I think a family could get together and watch it theoretically. I don't know if that's
a family with teenagers. Maybe I wouldn't say a family with little kids, but.
Right.
Yeah.
And then compared to his other films, we talked about Fritz the Cat, Heavy Traffic after before this, and right before this was Coonskin. So compared to those films,
it's a family film.
PG-rated family film. Yeah. But yeah, Bakshi was adamant about not talking down to children and just giving them like a good story, and giving them some fun characters and a little bit of a message. But I don't think he does it in an annoying way. I think he does it in an interesting way. And I do want to give a quick shout out to the Blu-ray edition that I bought because I purchased it, just because I was like, I'm going to watch a movie again. I haven't seen it in a while, and I remember really liking it. So the animation's beautiful. I'll get a Blu-ray. So I got this like really nice 35th anniversary edition of it. And it comes along with this nice book with some illustrations and concept art and a little write-up about it. Really short, but just kind of cool. If you're into this movie or love Bakshi or anything, I think it's like a cool item to pick up.
Always good to support physical media when you get the chance.
Yeah, I try to when I can.
Yeah.
Believe me, we're not getting any money from them. So this is just a personal, every once in a while you got to pick up that Blu-ray that you're thinking about. So it's a good one to get. So I think that's going to do it for Wizards. Next, we're going to switch gears a little bit and jump ahead to a film that Bakshi made actually in 1981. It's called American Pop, and that's a very different film, still personal and still unique in its own way. So we're going to talk about that next. Thanks for listening to Cult Movie Cult. You can find us on iTunes, Podbean, and Spotify, as well as on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, or if you'd like to officially join the cult and be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long for no side.